Let's do that.
People say, I had no idea.
Okay. Well, welcome, folks. We're here in a big Zoom room as usual. It's nice to see folks. Just as a reminder, we're all together in the Zoom room, whether you're a member of the public or an interested observer or a Vermont Climate Council member. And thanks everybody for helping us make this work as a Zoom meeting. Our sort of normal protocols around that is if you are a climate counselor or someone who's helping to present today, feel free. We encourage you to keep your camera on to help us see each other and be together if you're in a position to do that. I know folks a couple of you aren't in a position right now to do that. If you are observing our meeting today, we ask you to keep the camera off until we do some public comment later. And same thing, we ask you to refrain from using the chat until public comment time. So that's just trying to keep our Zoom world functioning for us here. So let me turn it over to your chair, Secretary Clauser, if you're able to welcome us today. And then I'm happy to do agenda or if you'd prefer, Secretary Clauser.
Sure, thanks, David. Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry for my camera. I'm having some technical difficulties with my add-on camera. And if I use my laptop, you'll all see up my nose for the entire meeting, which I'm trying to spare you from. So apologies while I try and fix that. Just to quickly run through the agenda today, I know we have a lot going on and want to try and stay on time. David will walk us through a review and approval of the minutes for the March 7th meeting. We'll move into our just transition reflection, which will be presented by Iris and is really her running through a suggested approach for youth engagement. Then at 11:25, we'll review the input received from different types of public engagement that has been going on and followed that conversation with a break. When we return from break at 12:15, David, I like this scrolling. It's fantastic. When we return from break, we'll have A&R and Julie present next steps in rulemaking. Moving on to subcommittee updates. And then at 1:25, we will talk about lessons learned from the legislative session and review a work plan for the remainder of the year. Or the calendar year anyway. Then finally, as always, public comment and adjournment at 2. And then David, I give it back to you to start with the March 7th, 2022 minutes.
Thanks so much. Excellent. Yes. So let's just do a quick pause before we dive right in. And that would be if folks have questions about that agenda that Kristen laid out, any friendly amendments to how we're going to use our time today? Okay, great. And as usual, Marion and Jane are posting in the chat all these meeting materials. We've got a lot of stuff posted on the website. So if you're seeing something, you can always click on the website if you want to have it on your own screen. So excellent. All right. So our usual start off with the minutes. You can click through the agenda to them. I'll give folks a moment to ensure that you get a second to review those if you haven't. Any questions folks have about those minutes that they want to raise up? I got a little interior chat about some typos. So we'll fix those. Anything folks need to mention? Does anybody need some more time to look at them? Okay. Great. So we'll treat those as approved. Thanks, everybody. Just before we go to this first piece on the agenda around the approach for youth engagement that Iris is going to lead off, I know Secretary Clauser, you had a few comments you wanted to say in leading into that. So maybe I'll pass it back to you as we get before we jump right into this next piece on the youth engagement.
Thanks, David. Yeah, we just wanted to take a moment on behalf of the entire council to thank Iris and for her participation, especially while she was doing her junior and senior year of high school and devoting so much time to the Climate Council. So we did do a letter on behalf of the Climate Council that I'm happy to read. I believe that Jane also attached it to the materials for folks and their reference. And I would also encourage folks who have worked with Iris more closely or want to extend some personal thank you or share a story to feel free to do that quickly after the letter. And David, maybe you can walk us through that. Folks can raise their hand, and but I wanted to make sure that people haven't had an opportunity to do that as well. So just turning quickly to the letter. Dear Iris, I want to thank you on behalf of the Vermont Climate Council for your service over the past year on the council and your significant contributions to advance the development of Vermont's initial climate plan. As a counselor, you have played a critical role on both the Just Transitions and Agriculture and Ecosystem subcommittees in supporting the learning process and drafting substantive sections of the CAP. At council meetings, you have leaned in and pushed the council to challenge our thinking and develop strategies that support and benefit all Vermonters. In addition, you've looked to elevate the further support the youth voice in the council and subcommittee process by putting forward a plan to include youth development and an infrastructure of those youth representatives to collaborate and have their learning supported behind the scenes through college credits and access to others to ask questions of. This will ensure that youth who have the biggest stake in climate action will be represented in the development of solutions from the onset. This will not only enhance the outcome, but lay the groundwork for buy-in from all Vermonters for substantive climate action. As you step down from the council and transition to college, we know that Vermonters will be better served in the years to come from the foundational work that you have done to drive climate action in Vermont. We applaud your commitment and look forward to watching you further influence policy and action in your career. Thanks so much, Iris.
Fantastic. Oh, that's so nice. I know that other people have things to say as well. Secretary Moore, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to add my sincere thanks, Iris. And I actually had the chance to meet in person just a week and a half or so ago now, and it was just as pleasurable as her engagement in the council. I am grateful for the voice that she has brought to this space, for all of her strong work, and can't wait to see what she does next.
So please jump in if you'd like to say something now. Obviously, there's opportunity to do this in another way as well, but now is a perfectly great time to say a few words if you have some. Joey, go ahead, please.
I just want to say my sincere thanks as well to you, Iris, and having had the privilege to work with you a little bit before you even joined the council. I know you've been doing this important work for so long. Thank you for working so hard and being the moral conscience of what we need to do in a really smart and thoughtful way. It's pretty awesome. And I too am looking forward to staying very much tuned into the work that you do next, and really hoping that we can continue to benefit from your leadership. We certainly need it. Thank you.
Jared, go ahead, please.
Just building off the letter, which was great. Thank you for reading that, Secretary Clauser. I just want to say, of course, thank you, Iris, for your substantive contributions on the council and in the subcommittees you're serving on. But I just want to say how impressed and grateful I am that after you were appointed, you didn't pull up the ladder behind you. You figured out how you could create more ladders for engagement for other youth, and that legacy is going to live on. So even though you're leaving the council, and we hope you won't go far, and we can continue to benefit from your leadership and thinking in the years ahead, I am just feeling really reassured and grateful that we're going to have so many young Vermonters whose future is so important and whose voices are so important in shaping that future, not just in one seat on the council, but in all of the council subcommittees because of your vision and collaboration. So thank you for thinking structurally about youth engagement going forward, and not just kind of how you interacted as one counselor.
Nice. Sue, go ahead, please.
Iris, I can't not extend my appreciation to you. You've been such a crucial member of our Just Transitions Committee. You have testified in the legislature on our behalf and on behalf of especially your generation. And obviously, I know you feel the urgency and have empowered many others through your great work. And I know you will continue on in your next endeavor. I remember our first conversation recruiting you to this and other activities, and I'm super proud, and you keep going, girl. Thank you.
June, go ahead, please.
Yeah, Iris, I just wanted to add my thanks and also let you know you've been so very impressive as a strong young woman. And as you continue to grow in your path, you're going to be a formidable woman in public life. And I look forward to that. I want you to know that you genuinely challenged me. And the surest sign of that was that I did not give you quarter. And I hope you understand that that was a compliment. It is the most sincere form of recognition of the value that you brought to the table, the strength of character you brought to the table, the commitment to viewpoint that you brought to the table, and frankly, your impact. You made me think twice on several occasions. I'm grateful for that. And I hope that you take that strength with you in a world that still finds it challenging to hear from powerful women. But you give me hope that that is quickly receding and that this is a more just and equitable world. So keep it up.
So a little love coming your way, Iris, there. I'm not quite sure how to let me give you a moment. There's things you want to say before you jump into this piece about your legacy and how you hope more youth voices are going to be part of the process.
Just thank you all so much, and I feel so grateful for the opportunity to share my voice in this space. I think that's something that's really unique for someone of my age, and I have just been so grateful for the opportunity to share my voice, and so grateful for the ability to collaborate with all of you. Yeah, thank you so much. I don't really know how to receive all that, but thank you all. Yeah, and I think that's a lovely transition into the proposal that we're bringing forward, because yeah, I mean, I've been the youth voice on this council, and I'm so excited to pass that along to someone else, and pass that along to someone else who's young and excited about challenging all of your ideas on how we can pursue intergenerational equity. And yeah, just thank you all so much for this. This has been a crazy process and a crazy year, and I am really thankful for all the work that you all are doing.
So I think you're right, Iris. It is a transition. If you want to talk about what your proposal, I'm happy to share it on the screen whenever you want me to, and walk us through what you're thinking about the future.
Yeah, if you could bring that up, that would be great. So as mentioned, I'm bringing forward a proposal for youth participation in the Vermont Climate Council. And it's been an amazing process. It's also been hard for me because I am in high school. And so a lot of these meetings tend to fall during the high school day, during the working day. And so providing some support for the next youth member on the Vermont Climate Council, and some places for other young voices to come into this process. And so the plan is to do that through adding additional youth representatives to the subcommittees, and having the representatives meet with the youth member on the Vermont Climate Council in a form so that they can all talk about the work that is happening in the subcommittees and create interconnections there, as well as just have greater voices for intergenerational equity throughout the council. And it's going to be supported by the incredible Vermont Energy and Education Program, so that we can have some adult support and capacity to help out there, and also the potential for college credits for students who are engaging in this work, because it is pretty high level policy work, and it is important work. So yeah, that's general. The proposal is pretty simple, to be honest, but the plan is to, we have some of these members already appointed to the subcommittees, which is incredible, and then we're planning to appoint more to the other 2 subcommittees, and then work with the youth representative as they come on and are appointed in my stead. So yeah, I think that's generally, I'm happy to entertain any questions, and happy to also give space to Mariah Kagi, who is from the Vermont Energy Education Program and would be helping to support the incoming youth representatives on the Climate Council. Yeah.
Great. And I wonder, Mariah, if you do want to say a word, introduce yourself and say a word about how you're thinking about how this will work.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. So yeah, Mariah Kagi, and I am the Energy Action Projects Manager with Vermont Energy Education Program. And a lot of my work really focuses on working with youth and empowering them to think about ways that they can create change and sort of what that looks like, but really focusing on where their passions are and their interests. And so to keep it concise, I would say that as soon as, and I also work with Youth Lobby to support them as we're trying to figure out the appropriate title in terms of adult ally, advisor, something along those lines. And so the point being that the ask is vital, as we know, to have a youth representative on the council. The ask of a full-time young person to take all of that time to be a representative, not knowing how to have the conduit of the communications in terms of what youth representation looks like, feels pretty unfair. And so I talked with Sophia quite a bit about that in the middle and end of her time at the council. And then Iris and I have been talking about this year, and just sort of thinking about sustainability and thinking about what it means to be a young person, and what empowerment in this position could look like. And so, yeah, so just sort of, it's been really exciting with Iris to create the structure around this. And part of the positioning that VEEP has is that we have been working, we work in schools all around the state, as well as in New Hampshire. And we have Youth Climate Leaders Academy, and we support Youth Lobby. And so we have these conduits of these amazing young people who are looking for places to come to be involved in this work. And so we can really create a community around that. And so this advisory council would support that sort of structure. And with that, we also have programs that are in place that this feeds into very easily with the other work that we do. And so, yeah, and so what that would look like is really depending on what the youth council needs. It could be just setting up meetings. It could be, really just listening to what they need and then following up with that support in whatever that looks like. And so that is what the direction will be. But in the shortest piece, just meeting support and whatnot, as well as course support if that's a direction that they want to go in.
Super. Okay. Really helpful. Thanks, Mariah. I'm glad you're here. And you're doing this work. So do counselors, any feedback or comments to Iris, Mariah, or others about the plan? The steering committee met and spoke about this, loved it, and just want to make sure that you as a full council are on board, have a moment to provide any feedback you want to as this gets going. I see a thumbs up. That's great. Any other feedback, folks, that, to make this stronger? Thoughts, reactions? Kashka, I just want to make sure folks know who Kashka is. Kashka is on the Just Transitions subcommittee, and has been working closely with Iris. Kashka, go ahead, please.
Firstly, I would just like to address Iris and say I am once again blown away by you. I think this is so important. You will be so missed. You have done such exceptional work on the Climate Council, and your voice has been incredible, and it will resonate through the years. And I hope to hear from you again. I think this is a great proposal, and I can see it through the subcommittees as well. I hope that the Climate Council supports it. And I think this is the way of paving the road for the future. So I could definitely see this in the subcommittees and even in the task groups. So once we get more people involved and the youth, I think this is the way of the future. This is the way to go. So thank you again, Iris. Thanks.
Thanks, Gashka. Great. Okay, any concerns before we say double thumbs up, let's go? Anything folks want to bring up? Okay, great. So this is the pathway forward. Thanks, Iris, for helping to shape it, create it, expand the idea of what's possible. So wonderful. Okay, great. I think that's it. Anything else, Iris, you want to say before we finish up on this piece? Okay. Great. All right, Jane, go ahead, please.
Yes. Well, first, I would be remiss if I didn't thank Iris for all of her work. There are counselors, and then there are counselors who really leaned in and helped us write the climate action plan. And Iris was above and beyond on exceptional support for actually drafting. She was a workhorse, and it's been a pleasure to get to know her as a mom and as a colleague. So thank you so much. And as far as the practice and implementation of Iris's proposal, since the steering committee met and started to discuss this, I did just want to say that we've been advancing as expecting that the council would support this great idea, and working with Mariah and Iris to start to stand up what that looks like. And we've had an open subcommittee process, nomination process for rural resilience, science and data, and just transitions, all of which have new nominees that represent the youth voice. And we'll be working closely with cross-sector and ag and eco, who didn't have an open nomination process because they weren't looking at the time for new members. But we'll work with them closely to also consider a youth voice. And then true to Iris's spirit, she really wanted us to make sure that we engage with the legislature around an open and equitable process to bring in applicants for Iris's counselor position. So as Iris steps down from being a counselor, we will pass along, Iris has agreed to write her own resignation letter. We'll pass that on to our contacts with the legislature and ensure that there's an open process for Vermont youth to put forward applications to join the council. So we'll keep you all apprised as that moves forward.
Great. Okay. Okay. Wonderful. So speaking of being open, the next piece we want to work on is around public engagement. And we've got the next 40 minutes or so to do a couple things. We want to just reinforce what we talked about in March. If you remember that we talked about a strategy for public engagement in March, we want to reinforce that. That's gotten, a little bit more refined. So Jane's going to walk us through what that strategy looks like around public and stakeholder engagement. And then we also want to say a little bit about what we're hearing, because there is engagement happening, there's activity happening, and we've got some feedback that we want to share in a summary form. So I'll help to share that based on what we're hearing, and I'll ask for some help doing that because some of that feedback comes from processes that others are doing, like Capstone and others, and Kashka has been involved in that. And so we can lean on some of the other folks here to help provide some additional flavor. Okay, so Jane, I think you're going to kick this off talking about the strategy, and I just shared slides, so just give me the heads up when you want to push forward on slides.
I was kind of taken off guard. You never share for me, but that's okay. We can do it. Okay, So as David mentioned, I'm going to just walk you through the public engagement strategy, which, as you all have seen at previous meetings, has been a living and breathing document that we've been working on closely with the Public Engagement Task Group. That's really a subset of the Just Transition Subcommittee, which is where and clearly articulated that component of implementation and action lives within the council. As we've been starting to move this forward, others from other committees who have relevant touch points with respect to this work have been joining. Most appreciated folks from cross-sector. Joey often comes to think about the role of transportation and the role of engagement more broadly because of her work outside of the council. Catherine Dimitrik has joined as we've been thinking about rural communities. So we're trying to really, continue the sort of implementation of breaking down silos and really not focused on where this fits with what subcommittee, but really getting the right people around the table to be developing a robust public engagement strategy. And you'll notice that we're calling it the Climate Action Plan strategy now, rather than the Climate Council strategy, because this is really going to be a cooperative body of work that is facilitated out of the Agency of Natural Resources, that is directed and guided by the task group with support there, but really is collaborative work to lift up the Climate Action Plan now and then for future iterations, so that we're building support, building robust solutions and ideas for future iterations of the Climate Action Plan. Next slide, David. So the public engagement strategy, really building off of all these previous conversations with you, with the public, with others, is really focused on three prongs. It's focused on building awareness around climate action efforts in the state, not just with people who are always at the table, but with people who are really experiencing impacts now and at a disproportional rate to others, and really thinking about how to engage other frontline communities across the state to lift up more diverse voices in this process. That's that second point, lifting up the voices and viewpoints of all community members across the state, and thinking about how we do that effectively through building relationships and communication channels that will help Vermonters work collaboratively in the future on climate action. Next slide. I think you've all seen this, but what we've tried to do as it's been evolving and we've been doing the work is think about this really as a proactive approach here that focuses on how to make the plan more accessible, not just a 300-page Word document, but how do we make it a living, breathing document? How do we continue to test with broad-based Vermonter support, public engagement, and then how we lift up those frontline and impacted communities specifically through targeted engagement, through partner organizations that also help us build those lasting relationships and communication channels. Next slide. So plan accessibility, and I dropped in the chat right before I started speaking the actual document that this pulls from, and there's more details in that document that you'll see here on the slide. But just to orient you before we actually walk through what we're hearing from Vermonters to date, the tools and the avenues in which we're exploring, wanted to give you a flavor for what this all looks like in action. So plan accessibility, it's really a two-pronged approach about both formatting, synthesizing, and visualizations that reach more Vermonters, but also thinking about how we make it more accessible to non-native English speakers. So we've been working on a new template for the Climate Action Plan. We've been thinking about how to make it more communicable through stories. Marion had sent out a survey to all of you to lift up and think about stories that we want to focus on, both in the Climate Action Plan and then also through a story map that we're working on creating, that we already have a template to run through and we'll be standing up with our GIS folks at A&R. But we want to really make the plan accessible to have Vermonters see themselves in it. We've also put 11 videos online, thanks to Kelly, had this great suggestion, Kelly Klein, of putting not only written format out there in other languages, but also videos. And on our website now, there are 11 videos in different languages, letting folks know that the plan is available to be translated in all of these languages. So that has been put out in the public sphere in both written format and now in oral format, so people can request the plan to be translated or sections of the plan in different languages. And we're also thinking about not only the plan, but if we're trying to make the plan more accessible through a story map, we're also thinking about how to lift up translation services through the story map. Next section, next slide. The broad-based engagement that we had put forward the last time we met, probably in December or January, around public engagement with all of you, was really focused on 2 forums, which have come and gone now. And those forums were in April. We held them online. They were well attended, over 100 participants. They were really focused in on a very short summary of what was in the plan. And we really tried to pivot to the ongoing work of the council so that folks could really authentically engage and lift up ideas that we could now bring back to you to help redirect priorities for the Climate Council. And that's what we're going to pivot to today in this presentation and conversation. But now that we've done those 2 forums, we know that it doesn't end there. If we're making a commitment to working with Vermonters, we have to think more broadly about what listening sessions look like and how to do those in a way that really target conversation that can be applied to setting priorities and work. So here's just some of the ideas that we're working on with the public engagement group around what those listening sessions could look like. They could be focused on the ongoing policy work that the council is working on, transportation, biomass. We're trying to anticipate what legislative priorities could look like next year and do that in a thoughtful way before policy is written, to actually hear from Vermonters what are the things they want the legislature to be considering around these policies, things like the renewable energy standard and perhaps things like the clean heat standard now. CAP implementation, the climate toolkit, we've already been doing stakeholder engagement. Marion's been leading with that task group to really lift up and think about how to make this actually usable and applicable to Vermonters, to actually put it in practice and not just put something out there that folks won't use. And then we want to use the ideas that we're hearing both through these public forums and our partner engagement to also think about other listening session topics that we could do. So really bringing full circle the engagement with Vermonters and trying to provide opportunities to talk about what they want to talk about. Next slide. So partner engagement, this has really been the focus of the public engagement task group. We've spent a lot of time with that group thinking about what this can look like and how we can build long-term sustainable relationships, and doing it in a slow and true meaningful way. And so David, through his capacity with Consensus Building Institute, is helping to bring some resources to bear in this space, as well as the networks that we've been able to build through the folks who bring their expertise and commit their time through the public engagement task group, like Kashka, like Amanda and Sue through Capstone. And that group has really been focused on how do we enhance awareness with these communities around climate action efforts, and how do we capture these voices and viewpoints in a way that actually is lifted up to the council. Because you'll hear in some of the feedback we're already getting is, yes, we're starting to do this, but people don't see the way that we're bringing it back into the work. So we're thinking about how to be clear and about the process for how we make decisions and how those voices and viewpoints get brought in. Again, it's really about building relationships, communication channels that will last not just 6 months, but years from now, and really laying the groundwork for that. And the focus for us, knowing that we have limited capacity and really trying to use and lift up the networks that we've built relationships with, the focus for this coming year has been around low-income Vermonters, rural communities, Indigenous communities, BIPOC Vermonters, and New Americans. And we'll start to talk a little bit about what those organizations and what that work looks like in the future. Next slide. So the conversations that are currently in progress to actually bring those voices to bear that I just mentioned have been occurring with the Vermont Council on Rural Development. And I just want to say, because I've gotten some great feedback from folks like Catherine Dimitrick and others, this is not meant to be the voice on rural communities. It is what we can do right now with capacity to build conversations that can translate to other voices, networks in these areas. So they're just the immediate conduit that we're working on through these partner organizations. And we fully appreciate that this doesn't go far enough. And we're just laying the groundwork to actually understand and think about how to do this in a meaningful way. So the Council on Rural Development, we've had some great conversations with them. They're launching a new climate workforce program with a new climate program manager that is starting next week. Really thinking about what that work looks like and how both we can help frame the conversations they bring to communities and how we can learn from the conversations that they have at the community level. We've been talking with Capstone and other community action agencies like CVOEO about how to work within low-income Vermonters with actually people on the ground, field representatives, tribal voices. Beverly Little Thunder, who serves on Just Transitions, has provided a great network for us to come into the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs, which she's hosting on her property in June, and we're hoping to collaborate with on. That will help bring us down to a smaller network of Indigenous organizations. We've worked with starting to work with the Vermont Language Justice Project, Vermont Lend, Health Disparities Cultural Competence Council, and DEC as well, the Department of Environmental Conservation has a contract with Rejoice and Vermont Center for Whole Communities. And while we're not privy, like part of that contract, part of the conversation that group is lifting up is around climate. So we're thinking about how to coordinate that work with them and use information that they're getting from that work in our work. So it's a lot, and it's Marion, David, and I like doing this as on top of everything else. And so it's slow to get going, but I really do think the work is starting to sort of lay the groundwork and seeds for this to really grow in the coming months and years. And it will be a focus of the Climate Action Office around what community engagement looks like. And so we're excited to bring additional capacity and focus to this work in the coming months. But for now, it's really just for us trying to sort of test with all of you how this feels and if it's feeling like it's starting to go in the right direction, and know that we're anticipating building on it in the coming months. And from here, I'm happy to answer questions on this sort of strategy part. And then David is going to help funnel and discuss with all of you what we've heard to date from these conversations, both with partners as well as the forum, in a means to actually have you all break into groups and have a conversation around how we actually utilize this. So I'll pause there, see if there's any questions, and then turn it back to you, David.
Great. Any questions for Jane? Great. Okay. Super. I'm having a bit of a barking dog problem here right now, but we'll solve that shortly. I'm happy to go forward and explain a little bit more about what we're hearing. So if that would be helpful, Jane, and then our idea, as Jane said, is to actually break into some smaller groups and have some conversation in the time we have. Okay. Great. So what we're going to see here is a synthesis, both of those public forums that Jane mentioned in April, and there's a Microsoft Word document that has a more complete synthesis of that is also very readable. So we highly encourage everybody to read it. And we're also folding into this synthesis some other pieces of engagement, and I'm curious where that slide went. But there's other things that are happening. Marion, in particular, around the climate toolkit and other pieces, have been engaging folks, municipalities and other. And the work that Capstone and some of the other community action agencies have been doing with the help of Kashka and others has been really important. And if you can hear my dog in the background, it's really annoying, that I'll ask Jane to cover while my dog recovers from the fact that someone's coming to my house right now. All right, but let's dive into it. And this is a synthesis of all these different pieces. And I will say, quite a bit has been happening, and Akashka can say a little bit more about the work, for instance, that she and some colleagues have been doing about literally going where people are at, food pantries and people in housing developments and other places, right, to just show up and talk to people. And so that's really important that everybody in the council know that those kinds of conversations have been happening. And we can talk a little bit more about that in a sec. Okay, so let me walk through these things real quick. And these slides are also posted on the website. So what are we hearing? People are really applauding the council and the Just Transition Subcommittee for the Just Transitions principles, the scoring rubric, and they're saying, use them, right? Use them more. There was a fair amount of comments around what has been described as apparent disconnect between the way the council is really trying to center in equity and some of the way the legislative actions have been happening. Some frustrations were expressed about that. This work around equity and just transitions feels very new to a lot of communities, and that means they're going to need support, right? Because this is new work for folks. What we're hearing around weatherization and housing, we're going to need to define this a little bit better if people know they're hitting the goal. All right, let's make sure we get the definitions right. Municipal leaders want education, want more resources. Sorry about my dog. I really apologize if it's annoying. And the mention, as we've heard Chris Camping and others say, that the gaps around the way building codes are and the gaps around enforcement are making this challenging. A final couple comments here. The council really should be focusing on reducing upfront costs and particularly for those who can least afford it. And finally, again, this is a Chris Campany comment that gets echoed out in some of these public conversations, that think about these electric service upgrades that needs to happen, right? And that should be part of weatherization conversations as well. Okay, so that's around weatherization and housing. Just a few of the highlights. Again, I encourage you to read the full document around the public forums and some other documents we'll be making available.
But David,
Okay.
can I just add something to the weatherization real quick? Sorry about that.
Absolutely, yep.
So the weatherization, what I've been hearing on the ground, and again, that's just from me having boots on the ground, and I've heard this often enough that I would like to bring it up, that the paperwork associated with the weatherization is, it's too, I guess I don't know if it's too confusing or if it's just it's too much for some folks to even try to digest. So I'm not quite sure of the process myself, but that's something that I've been hearing often enough that I would like to share it. So there's definitely some things to work out, right?
Thanks, Kashka. Yeah. And I'll have a little bit more at the very end of this presentation too on that. And so I'm glad you brought it up. Moving through on some of the other topics, a fair amount around agriculture and ecosystems that we heard at the forums and elsewhere. Some of the key points is looking for communities to better support working lands, given the amount of pressure from residential development right now in rural areas. So a lot of comments around that. A fair amount of advice for you all as a council. We would like you to focus more on, and then a bunch of ideas, right? So some of those ideas you can see on the page here, whether it's looking more holistically or looking around non-technical approaches like nature-based solutions, a couple comments around pesticides and herbicides, and alike. So things that they would like more emphasis on in the comments we've heard. And a specific shout out to say the work of the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee and the connections with you all as a full council. They're looking for more connection and communication. On what we're hearing on transportation, very happy to see the council leaning into transportation this year. Very positive that that's happening. Sort of the big theme is, yes, the electric transformation is really important. And a lot of folks saying, I want more focus on reducing vehicle miles traveled and those kinds of emphasis, whether it's through bike ped, whether it's through public transportation or more creative approaches to public transportation. I mean, these are all part of what you've done on transportation. I know it's part of what the task group's doing, but just a shout out from the groups, from these public forums and elsewhere saying, please focus on this. Municipal leaders looking for models and which they could refer to and or implement. And finally, a real shout out on the compact settlement things that are mentioned in the CAP and trying to continue to work on those issues and think beyond, sort of what we currently see. Okay, so that's on transportation. Biomass and clean heat standard. This was happening all, in March, April. And so this was very live. There was a lot of concern among some participants about biomass in this. We have a biomass task group. So, this is applicable to their work around the sustainability of biomass. Some, encouragement like the clean heat standard would have provided or does provide, it could provide in the future an avenue for incentivizing where other incentives haven't worked. And when thinking about biomass and thinking about electricity and energy more broadly, encouraging Vermont to think beyond its borders, concerned that the life cycle analysis, while a step in the right direction, may be too limited in doing that. And frustrations about how the clean heat standard played out in the legislature over the last several months. Okay, I've got one or two more of these. Public outreach, encouraging the council to do more, right? Do more. Essentially saying probably most Vermonters really don't know what's going on with the council's work. For some people, it's been difficult to know how to engage in the process, not quite sure how to get their voice heard. And not, as Jane says, some concerns that views are not actually making it back to the council and into the council decision-making, right? So how do we address that? But that's a voice we're hearing. Partner organizations can be helpful in getting the word out for meetings, and a request that future meetings be focused around more specific topical areas so that conversations can get really down into content a little more than, say, broad conversations. Okay, other takeaways, folks looking for an all hands on deck. What can we be tapping into other organizations, institutions, leveraging the private sector more? Looking for the state to do a better job of really saying, what is this thing going to cost to implement? Looking for support from municipalities, what's already been mentioned, and a sense that the legislative process hasn't fully benefited from the learning that went on in developing of the CAP and how to support the legislature in that learning and some of the learning that went on here in the council. And a specific shout out to considering this idea of climate migrants in Vermont being a destination and how to be thoughtful about that. Okay. And this is something, Kashka, I pulled from one of your summaries that speaks to what you were just saying. When Kashka and others were out having these conversations, some of the things they heard were this, and Kashka, I welcome you to improve on this summary. Folks feeling financially burdened by the cost of cooling their homes now, and obviously rising energy costs. Other issues you can see here were raised when Kashka and colleagues were out asking people about how they're experiencing change. As Kashka mentioned, difficulty navigating and managing confusing paperwork around programs that are designed to help. Folks aren't aware of programs, or folks might feel that the sort of threshold to get into programs is a little too costly even. Kashka, would you want to refine or improve this summary?
Sure. Thank you for that, David. Yes, I mean, I've been working with through Capstone, thanks to Sue, in doing community outreach efforts with Indra, who's now a new part of Just Transition Subcommittee. And our focus was on low and moderate income Vermonters, and more of a focus on low income Vermonters, I think, as well. But doing both. And we did everything from changing the survey a little bit so it would be more palatable to for folks that, again, were just not involved in the process, so that it would be more of a specific issue driven focus for the folks who are taking the survey. So, for example, again, asking, how they've been affected by certain things and, what they feel about certain things, and can they expand on certain issues, which I think gave us, the answers were very honest. There's a lot of anxiety around climate change. There's a lot of fear. There's also distrust that no matter what they feel or what is being said is not going to be, they're not going to see that in policy and legislation and laws, that again, and for historically, they've been left behind, and nobody really cares. We know that's not the case. We know that we're trying to change this. We know that we're doing the best we can. And for me, I think it would be wonderful to hear from the council members how we can better give you the information that we're hearing through public engagement, so that is translated onto the policy makers and subsequently to everything else that's going to be going on in the future. Because building trust and moving at the speed of trust, which is in the principles, is really important, especially for communities that have historically been left behind and not really listened to. So I think that would be extremely important for us to do. And I would love to hear how better we can do that as a task group, give you that information. Thank you.
Fantastic. Great. All right, folks. This has been a little bit longer than I thought it would be in terms of presenting the information. And what we're going to do is just push the brake back a little bit and take a little bit of time out of the rulemaking conversation. What we would love, and let's just make this 10 minutes, Cam, when we send people out. We would love to get people actually in smaller groups talking about this and how this presentation, both in the strategy and what you're hearing from feedback, how does that impact the way you view the council's work? That was the first question we have there. And I want to stick with the idea of hope too. Like, what makes you hopeful in all this? Like, because we want to build on that and make sure that that's a centerpiece of the work going forward. So what we've done is kind of made some random groups for you as counselors of 3 to 4 folks. And we're going to give you 10 minutes. If you're a member of the public, Cam's going to set this up. My colleague Cameron Hager, who's on the call here, will set this up so you can opt in as an observer to one of these breakout groups if you want to, or just stay back here for the 10 minutes and wait for folks to come back. I'll ask all observers, if you drop into a small group conversation, you remain observer with your camera off, and the same rules apply there. But feel free to drop into one of these small group conversations. I'll drop these 2 questions in the chat right now, so they're there. You don't forget them. And let's just do 10 minutes. But I'd love to get people just talking about this a little bit and what this all means for you as the council going forward. So Cam, if you're ready to do this, let's just go into groups real quick and have a conversation. We'll be back in 10 minutes. We'll do a quick debrief and then go to break. So you'll be prompted to join. Excellent. And Kashka, why don't you drop into one of those? You can ask Cameron to drop you in, or just you can do it yourself if you want to as well.
Doesn't matter which one, David? You want me to?
Nope, doesn't matter at all.
Okay, great.
If anybody has difficulty, you can press the breakout room button at the bottom of your screen, and you should be able to see options to join different rooms. I see that some people are doing that. If you have any difficulty, let me know.
Cam, everything okay?
Yep, I think so.
Great. I might pop into one group or two, or I'll be right back.
So.
That is always brutal to get pulled back in like that. So I apologize to every single person that was in the middle of a sentence. It's a very strong power that's awarded to the machine in this. Okay. So I hope that was interesting. I just listened into one conversation for a little bit. I found it really interesting. Let's just take a handful of minutes and see if there's some quick things you want to shout out. We don't need to replicate everything that happened in those conversations, just sort of quick shout outs of what's sticking here. We'll go to break at about 12:15. We'll come back in 10 minutes. But just if folks want to shout out and want to make sure that something gets really emphasized right now, based on that conversation you just had, let's do it. No particular order. Just if there's something you really want to make sure gets heard, go ahead and shout it out now.
Finding resources to get things done and making sure we prioritize what's next.
Great. Thanks, Kashka. Resources, prioritization. Yep.
I would
Other
shout
thing-
out. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Go ahead,
I
Michelle.
would shout out the need to be able to communicate complex analyses and outcomes of research and how that impacts this work to the public. You know, how are we going to get this message out there in a consumable manner?
Nice. Yep. Yep. Anything else people want to shout out and make sure it gets heard?
One theme for us was the balance between public engagement to improve and about program implementation as compared to public engagement regarding policy recommendations, and that both are important in figuring out that balance and how to do those well. Came up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tension, isn't it? Other things folks want to shout out? Okay. So I think going forward, I think all of us are eager for input on particularly how stuff is getting lifted up and into the space of the task groups and into this space in the full council. So if there's feedback folks want to give us whenever, now or later, that would be well received, because this is the key piece, right? Is not only the building awareness, but also lifting up those voices and putting it right here in the decision-making space and the conversation space of the council, the task groups, the subcommittees, et cetera. Okay. Great. Well, thanks, everybody. Let's go ahead and take a break. It's 12:11. Let's come back let's just make it 15-ish minutes at 12:25. Am I doing that right? Let's come back at 12:25 and we'll jump into the rulemaking piece. Okay, so we'll see you back here at 12:25. We'll jump into the rulemaking piece and keep going with the meeting. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you in a moment. Okay, so I think we've got a critical mass back here. So our next piece is on the rulemaking, and I'll turn it over to Secretary Moore to kick that off about what's going on around the rulemaking. So Secretary Moore, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'd just like to make sure Megan O'Toole's on too, because I'm going to give a brief introduction and then kick things over to her, but don't want to do it if she's not back yet.
I'm here, Julie.
Fantastic. All right. So just as folks may recall, there's some fairly specific requirements contained in the Global Warming Solutions Act around the rulemaking process for any rules that were identified as part of our climate action plan. And the rules in the climate action plan that were called for were related to the adoption of the California Clean Car and Clean Truck standards. In order to remain consistent with the Global Warming Solutions Act, we need to be in a position to file the draft rules with the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rules, also called ICAR, by July 1st of this year. And backing up further, we actually need to provide copies of this information to the relevant committees of jurisdiction within the legislature sooner. The good news front on all of this is we don't have a lot of wiggle room when it comes to the clean car and clean truck standards. Our choices are really to adopt what California has proposed or to adopt the federal level standards. And so Megan is going to take a few minutes this afternoon and walk through what California has proposed in terms of rulemaking in both of these spaces.
Thank you, Julie. And I'm going to share my screen really quick and walk through a brief presentation that reflects a lot of what hopefully folks had a chance to review in the materials that Jane sent around.
Megan, I might just take a moment and just introduce you.
Thanks, Jane.
So for in case everybody doesn't know Megan O'Toole, Megan O'Toole is the Mitigation and Strategy Coordinator within the Department of Environmental Conservation, Air Quality and Climate Division. She's also joined by her colleagues, I think Deirdre Ritzer and
Rachel Stevens.
And Rachel. Okay, is Deirdre here too? And Rachel is Deirdre works within the Air Quality and Climate Division as well within DEC, and Rachel is the attorney for the Air Quality and Climate Division. So they have been the team at doing the heavy lifting to get us to where we are today and put together the documents that were provided to you all early this morning ahead of today's meeting. So thank you for being here and walking us through this.
Sure thing. So I'm just going to go through mainly the substance of the rules themselves and can take some questions and maybe have some discussion after I do that. So as Julie mentioned, we adopt these rules pursuant to our authority in the Clean Air Act to have unique and more stringent standards that are reflective of the California program. And because of the provisions of the Clean Air Act that allow us to do that, we don't have really any flexibility in amending the substantive provisions or the stringency of these rules. They have to be identical to the state of California's program. And so that's the situation that we're in, along with all of our other partner states that choose to go that path. And we have previously adopted motor vehicle emission standards that are identical to California's. We began doing this in the 1990s. So this is a program that we've been building upon for decades now. And so I really regard this step as kind of just building upon a very solid existing program that Vermont has been implementing for a number of years. So just to review the list of rules that the Climate Action Plan included as part of the transportation pathways is Advanced Clean Cars 2, which is an amendment to an existing program that we already have in Vermont, Advanced Clean Cars 1. So this is building upon an existing program. And we historically have not heavily regulated medium and heavy duty vehicles in the state of Vermont. We have mostly regulated medium duty vehicles, but not so much on the heavy duty vehicle side. And so adopting the next three rules in this list will be a significant build on our existing program in terms of adding regulations that address heavy duty vehicles more robustly. So the second rule is Advanced Clean Trucks, which is an electrification standard for medium and heavy duty vehicles that is imposed upon the manufacturers of those vehicles. A criteria pollutant related rule for heavy duty vehicles called the Low NOx Heavy Duty Omnibus. We have some of these provisions already adopted that will be amended, and then we have some new provisions that we'll be adding. And then a phase 2 greenhouse gas emission standard for heavy duty trucks and truck trailers. And this will be an entirely new rule that we'll add to our program. So Advanced Clean Cars 2, as I said, is an amendment to our existing program. It requires the ramp up over time, starting with model year 2026, up to 100% ZEVs by 2035. And what this means is that auto manufacturers will be required by model year 2035 to for 100% of the passenger and light duty trucks that they deliver for sale to the state of Vermont will have to meet the definition of zero emission vehicle in the rule. And then the Advanced Clean Cars program also comes with updated criteria pollutant standards. And when I say criteria pollutant, I mean kind of your more traditional air contaminants that you might think of coming from a motor vehicle, like particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide. Those are all things that we regulate from a motor vehicle emission perspective as well in our existing program, and that will be built upon through these amendments. And then what's great to see in this rule as well is some enhanced consumer protection measures, especially regarding warranties of electric vehicles and their durability standards, meaning how long they're projected to be useful and operational. So we call that useful life of a vehicle. And this is great, especially in the electric vehicle realm, because it requires certain warranty life on batteries, for example. So consumers will be protected if, for example, some of the newer technology that we're seeing doesn't perform as expected. The auto manufacturers will be held accountable for that. Advanced Clean Trucks, as I mentioned, is a new rule. It will apply to any manufacturer of medium and heavy duty vehicles over 8,500 pounds or 8,500 pounds of the gross vehicle weight rating of those vehicles. And the standard kind of varies across the different medium and heavy duty weight classes, but at least 30% ZEVs will need to be achieved by 2030. And then by 2035, again, the percentage of ZEVs that need to be delivered varies, but it's 40% or higher, depending on the vehicle class by 2035. And this rule will begin with model year 2026. So the criteria pollutant standards for heavy duty vehicles is also something that we're adopting. And this is something that we, while not squarely related to greenhouse gases, it is required that we adopt this rule in order to adopt Advanced Clean Trucks. They go hand in hand. And so that's why we're doing this here as well. But we're also going to see a number of really beneficial results of this rule in terms of public health and again, durability and enhanced warranty requirements as applied to these vehicles. And these will be cleaner engines. So we'll be seeing reductions in the emissions of nitrogen oxides from these vehicles. And this is also effective in model year 2026. The final rule is the greenhouse gas emission standards for heavy duty trucks and their trailers. The trailers specifically have efficiency standards, so they're designed to be the most efficient when they're operating in tandem with the truck tractor that they're attached to. So this sets standards to reduce emissions from those types of vehicles. There's a number of different types of vehicles that are defined and covered in this rule. And this rule was really meant to be harmonized with the structure, timing, and stringency of the federal phase 2 standards that are already in effect at the federal level. And California, even though they are allowed this special provision in the Clean Air Act to operate in a more stringent space and hold auto manufacturers more accountable and to more stringent standards, they do try to work as hard as they can with the federal administration to harmonize standards so that auto manufacturers don't have to build 2 different vehicles for each standard. And so that's something that's happened in the past, and depending on the federal administration has kind of come and gone. But this is an example of where those standards are harmonized. And again, this will be effective in model year 2026 again. So in terms of next steps and ANR's compliance with the Global Warming Solutions Act, we'll file these proposed rules with ICAR on July 1st. We'll actually be filing them a little bit in advance of July 1st so that we can present them at ICAR's July hearing, which I believe is on July 11th. So we will be meeting all the timing requirements to present the rules at that time. And as Jane and Julie mentioned, these are really working drafts. These materials that have been provided to you today are works in progress. We are still waiting on some analysis of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule in terms of its emissions benefits. So you probably saw, if you reviewed the supplemental information and the technical support document, that we have some parentheticals with placeholders in there to update as we get that analysis from the contractor that we're working with through our stakeholders and partners and other states. And we will be sure to, provide updated materials to the council as we work to finalize them leading up to the ICAR deadline. And then we expect to have the rules, all 4 rules adopted by the end of the year. And we will need to do that not only for compliance with the Global Warming Solutions Act, but also because we want to implement these rules before the end of the year so that they can be effective model year 2026, because the Clean Air Act requires a certain amount of lead time for auto manufacturers to be prepared to implement changes to their fleet. So as Jane mentioned, I'm joined today by Deirdre Ritzer, who's our Mobile Sources Program Manager in the Air Division, and Rachel Stevens, who is a DC Associate General Counsel assigned to the Air Division. And we're happy to try to answer any questions or participate in discussion about the process or the rules in general. So thank you. And I put our email addresses here in case anyone has any specific questions. You're welcome to reach out if you would like to dig into the rules a little bit more. I know it's definitely a complex suite of rules. So certainly appreciate that it's a lot of information to digest quickly, but we're happy to answer any questions.
Super. Great. So questions for Megan and her team. Bram, go ahead.
How many other states adhere to California's rules?
That's a great question, Bram. It depends on the particular program. So there are some states, for example, that have only adopted like the light duty or light duty truck standards that California implements. And then there's some states that also have the medium and heavy duty. Up until this rule is finalized, Vermont will have been in that former category of only states that have adopted the passenger car and light duty truck and medium duty rules. And so it really depends. But to answer your question, it's roughly, I think, around 20 states at this point that have adopted some version of California's program.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Super. Joey, go ahead, please.
Well, mostly what I wanted to say was thank you, Megan and Deirdre and Rachel and so many others who have been lifting this, helping to lead the transportation conversation. I just know what a boatload of work it is and the good work that you've delivered. This is super helpful and just very much appreciate it's on track and that you guys have been doing so much. So just mostly a sincere thank you. And then just a question for you, potentially just to ground us all again, just, Megan, how this fits into like the progress, sort of like our progress, if you just will remind folks, because you've done a lot of research there in terms of how this puts us on track to begin to make progress towards our requirements.
Yeah, and folks probably noticed in the technical support document that there's kind of a placeholder for that content at the moment because we don't yet have the full picture of the emissions reductions that we're going to see from Advanced Clean Cars 2. So we didn't feel like it was an appropriate time to draw those conclusions, not having that data yet. But folks that have tuned into previous webinars that have been hosted by the Transportation Task Group have probably seen the analysis that Colin Smythe from the Air Division has put together regarding the analysis of the kind of transportation gap, the emissions gap in the transportation sector that we realize will continue to exist even after we adopt and implement this suite of rules, because this isn't going to get us the entire way in terms of meeting our transportation emission reduction goals, but it will take a significant chunk. And I'll just say really generally and at a high level that we anticipate that if all of the vehicles that will be delivered to the state of Vermont pursuant to these rules are actually bought by Vermonters and fleet owners in Vermont and placed in service, that we'll get about a third of the way to our 2030 goal just for the transportation sector. So not GWSA in its entirety, but just for the transportation sector. And that's again, assuming that people buy all these vehicles and place them in service on Vermont roads and retire their ICE vehicles. So a lot of caveats. But that presentation, I believe, is available online, and that particular image that Colin has presented a few times now about that transportation gap. So we can share that again if that would be helpful.
Okay, great. I saw some hands up and now down. Anything else from counselors that questions for Megan team on this? Okay.
I would just note quickly, I thought that was a great description, Megan, and I would just note that, you know, roughly a third of the emissions reduction needed in the transportation sector translates to somewhere around, give or take, 10% of the overall needed reductions by 2030 for the whole Global Warming Solutions Act.
Thanks, Jared.
Okay. All right, so very helpful. You've got contact information there, and thanks for that. Why don't we go into our subcommittee updates now? Unless Jane, you want to take us somewhere else right now.
I want to take us somewhere else, but just wanted to put one point on the rulemaking conversation that we didn't. I want to encourage everyone to read the letter that Secretary Moore sent Secretary Clauser on behalf of the agency to the council, which does go into sort of the detailed components of the requirements of the GWSA around rulemaking, and just lift up that we will be doing public engagement around the rulemaking over the summer. That is a specific component of the GWSA that is unique. Ironically, really the JWSA does not speak to public engagement for the climate action plan development, but it does speak very comprehensively about public engagement in the rulemaking space. And so we'll be thinking about what that requirement on us, because it speaks to statewide engagement targeted at frontline and impacted communities, most impacted by the rules. So we'll be working closely with the Public Engagement Task Group and others within our agency to ensure that we're lifting up what that, being true to that requirement of the GWSA in the space.
Nice. Thanks, Jane. Okay. Great. So why don't we go ahead and transition into subcommittee updates? And I don't have a particular order for this, and it also can be a little bit overlapping with task group updates. So I wonder, you know, let me just sort of walk through some of the subcommittees, and folks can say, oh yeah, well, the actions in this task group, et cetera. So I wonder, let's start with science and data, and folks on that subcommittee. Can you say a little bit of what's going on or where the action is, whether it's in a task group or where the subcommittee itself? Some science and data folks, do you want to just give us a quick heads up what's going on?
Megan, do you want to start or do you want me to? Is that raising your hand or pointing at me?
I was pointing at you. Go ahead, Jared.
So we had a science and data subcommittee meeting. I believe it was just the week before last. One of the main things that we focused on was reviewing. I think we ended up getting something like 17 nominations, maybe more, for new subcommittee members. And so we went through a really careful, thorough process to look at those nominations in relation to the criteria we'd set, some of the gaps that we saw, wanting to make sure we have a diversity of expertise and lived experience and representation on a whole range of demographic factors. And we're really pleased that the subcommittee arrived at consensus on recommending 7 new members, including a youth member, to tie back to our earlier conversation, to join the subcommittee. We just missed the last steering committee meeting, so that recommendation will be formally considered at the next steering committee, but we are hopeful and looking forward to having a number of new members join, and we'll share that list of names once it's finalized. It's also up. If you go to the calendar on the council page, it was listed with the agenda items for our last Science and Data Subcommittee meeting on May 4th. There was also, and Megan may want to speak more about this, we have had a task group that has been working on a request for proposals, an RFP related to life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, a draft that the full subcommittee provided feedback on after the task group had. I think that's nearly ready. There may be nearing going out. I'll let Megan speak to where that stands. And yeah, we also, so let me pause there and go to Megan.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah, so I think that the draft of the life cycle analysis RFP is nearing finalization. I think it's with Jane at the moment to work on getting it posted and out into the world. Jane, I don't know if you want to, if that's correct, then that's great, but if you want to elaborate more. Okay. And yeah, so I think that we ended up in a really good place with that RFP in terms of it having some broad utility to achieve a variety of goals and hopefully be even potentially useful for other purposes in an analysis in the future. But again, it is, it is somewhat limited to in terms of analyzing the life cycle emissions from our energy use. But I think, again, we were able to kind of get a lot packed into that package. So hopefully it will be useful, and we look forward to reviewing the proposals with the task group.
Great. Okay, so that's science and data. Anything else, Jared and other members of that subcommittee want to say? All good? I'll just remind folks of this helpful image. I think Marion is responsible for this image of a way of understanding the work that's happening right now. And so as other subcommittees provide updates, just let me know if you want me to put this image up, because it shows the relationship between a lot of the work that's happening in these task groups, and how they're connected into multiple subcommittees. So just let me know if this is a helpful image to share when you're giving an update. Let's keep going. Cross sector, anything you want to share, either from a task group perspective or what else is going on?
The cross sector had a meeting a couple of weeks ago. We're meeting again on Thursday of this week. The transportation and biomass work groups are active, and in a minute I'll ask the leaders of those work groups to comment. Some personnel changes on the committee. As everybody knows, Peter Walk has left his position at DEC, and TJ Poor has kindly agreed to step into that position as co-chair of the committee, and I'm looking forward to working with him as well as we did with Peter. The subcommittee also accepted a recommendation from Science and Data to add Adam Sherman from VEIC to our committee as a person with needed expertise, especially in life cycle analysis. And let me turn it over to Joey and TJ for quick reports on the work groups.
Just one comment quickly. There's been a lot of changes to subcommittees and subcommittee composition. Technically, part of that process is that the steering committee reviews and approves the subcommittee changes. The ones that you'll hear about perhaps in these updates from cross-sector and then also rural resilience, and you just did from science and data, have not gone to the steering committee yet. They weren't ready before the last steering committee meeting to be reviewed and approved. So just note, these are, I'm not sure if the council, we're not prepared to approve them today. They are pending changes approved by the subcommittees themselves, but not formally blessed by the steering committee yet.
Thanks, Jane.
Yeah, that's helpful. Joey, you want to talk about transportation?
Sure. Thanks to Jane for helping to promote last Friday's webinar on regional transportation, cap and invest policies, and to everyone else who promoted it and or attended. That was the third in our series of trying to sort of engage folks in the conversation about, you know, where we stand and how we're going to sort of orient ourselves to fill the gap currently in the plan without Transportation Climate Initiative program on the table, or with a level of uncertainty around that. So now I think I've mentioned, but I want to mention again that people know that we have a regular transportation task group meeting Mondays at 3:30, and I think we're going to regroup, not today, but next week, to sort of figure out how the ongoing public engagement work, you know, takes shape, and how that is connected to what Megan and Jane just articulated in terms of the robust public engagement requirements through the rulemaking process in the transportation space. And so we're focused there. I would say that we had been hopeful that we were going to be able to identify some dollars to inform a technical analysis, you know, to sort of look at different options. As you all probably remember, we now have had 2 webinars on looking at sort of performance-based approaches, thanks to Vermont Clean Cities Coalition for partnering with on that webinar, and then also another webinar on cap and invest strategies. So, but we don't have the dollars to do a sort of a technical analysis about the different policy or regulatory approaches, you know, sort of cost benefit and analysis. So I don't know if Jane or someone else wants to sort of lay out anything more related to how we might hopefully fill that gap, to give us, you know, the details that would be helpful to have. I would say that, you know, Vermont has pretty strong sort of robust analyses that we can draw from, but not specific analysis to inform this conversation. So I don't know if there's a state team like Jane or Megan, if you might provide a better update on the technical analysis component.
Well, we did apply for funding from the U.S. Climate Alliance. We asked for $100,000. They offered us 21,000 or 20, maybe it was 27,000, but it was a much smaller amount. And their rationale behind the funding, the lower amount of funding, was some pushback on consideration of IIJA funds, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Funds, and a suggestion that that could fund the analysis that we were looking to do. That is not clear 100% yet. That I know Michelle and Andrea, others on this call, could speak to this in greater detail, but the focus of those funds are really on how to realize greenhouse gas emissions from programs that AOT is already putting on the ground. And so we're working closely with the Agency of Transportation to consider if those funds could be used, and what the questions would be that we would answer around a larger analysis around a system-wide strategy, a sector-wide strategy, I should say. And so we're hopeful that we'll still be able to pursue some kind of analysis, but the timeline is certainly a lot different now because we had hoped to already have a vendor under contract.
Thanks, Jane. Can I just ask a follow-up question, Jane, for the timeline thing? Because is it a timeline in which it may not sync up very well with the fall, when this council will be asked to consider recommendations coming out of the task group and the subcommittees?
The Transportation Task Group and cross-sector hasn't have not considered a reorientation of the timeline yet, based on the technical analyses. And I actually would suggest that, and maybe others on the group should say this too, but I have felt like there's still momentum to put forward recommendations this fall. And if there's other analyses, as Joey was just alluding to, that we could draw on, and that we could hope to enhance beyond that.
Great, super. Anything else on transportation in the task group? Okay, thanks, Joey. Biomass, TJ, is that you?
I think so, but I'll let others who are on the task group jump in if necessary. So a lot of the work, well, you may remember, just the ground setting, may remember that members of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee came forward with a number of recommendations in November surrounding biomass and different uses and harvesting practices. The council tabled those recommendations to take up and consider in the coming year. And this biomass task group was set up to kind of tackle those recommendations. Spent a lot of time on scoping and prioritizing, and have come up with a prioritization based on a number of things. First, elevating everybody's baseline understanding of the issues surrounding biomass, from definition to current harvesting practices to greenhouse gas implications. And then prioritizing based on kind of information, and as information will be coming in through other processes like the life cycle analysis work of the Science and Data Subcommittee. With that, we're left with a couple of priorities to kind of make parallel progress while there's other analyses are going on. And one is to continue to consider the operation and expanding of existing or the development of new electric-led biomass facilities, better understanding their impacts to surrounding communities, citing cultural, historic, archaeological sites and resources, and the impacts to residents, air quality and natural resources. And then again, the use of material in those facilities with an eye towards harvest activities, and then really also thinking about defining what expansion of district heating might actually mean to a facility. Also utilizing research to look at biomass procurement and better understanding how that happens, where it happens, and what practices are used in Vermont, and developing recommendations there. And then considering components of an educational program going forward. And so again, I think the task group is most of the way there in a prioritization. It's not that those other issues have gone away, like consider biomass, use for heating and thermal applications. There was some discussion of hey, the council recommended a clean heat standard that included biomass, that this is already decided. But I think in the last couple of meetings, we've realized that, hey, let's see what happens with a clean heat standard, number one. And then number two, that just because the council decided that in last year doesn't mean we can't continue to learn and inform ourselves, and if necessary, rethink a position. So we had some technical expertise come, and we'll continue to do that over the coming weeks to elevate everybody's understanding and go from there. And I invite others who are at the task group to add to that summary if I missed anything.
Thanks, TJ. That's great. Improvements to that summary from others who are involved in the work? Okay, great. Thanks, TJ. All right. So those are two substantive pieces of work, the transportation, the biomass, that are going on. Billy, is there anything else from Ag and Ecosystem you want to mention in addition to the biomass work?
We are also participating in the agricultural emissions work group. As Jane indicated, there's some challenges around the funding of that, but we've got members participating there. Our subcommittee may be an outlier, but the last time we met was late March. We don't have any meetings scheduled for May or June at this point. Our members have largely indicated that they don't feel the need to meet regularly unless there's action or pieces that we need to review as a group coming out of those task groups. So we may be, approaching the work slightly differently than some of the other groups. So I thought I'd mention that in part, given Iris's proposal on how the youth participants are going to participate and staff the council and participate in the council process going forward, and be designated to subcommittees, the steering committee may want to think about the relative action and work associated with different subcommittees as those folks are named. But that's pretty much it. We're kind of in a holding pattern as a group to see where these other task groups move with the recommendations.
Super. Okay. Thanks, Billy. That's helpful. Rural resilience, there's a bunch of things going on over there around the Municipal Vulnerability Index, the climate toolkit. Folks want to speak about those task groups and or the subcommittee. I'm just looking who's on the call right now because I think Catherine's not on the call. Erica, you're on the call.
Well, David, you covered it. So there's our update.
Sorry.
Apologies in advance. You're going to hear my roosters crowing at each other. So the most of the work is happening at the task group level with both of those items. We are also excited, subject to the steering committee's approval, to welcome 4 new members onto the subcommittee, including a youth member, and excited also to have some additional geographic diversity with those members coming on board. So with that, I'm not going to drag on the update for too long. We do have a meeting scheduled at the end of the month. We've been kind of taking them month by month. If we can provide an update via email and save folks a couple of hours of their time, we've been doing so, and making sure that we're focusing our subcommittee time in meetings on substantive things that need to be accomplished. So I'll stop there. I do have an update on those task groups if there's nobody else on the task groups that want to provide an update. But with that, I'll turn it over to either the MVI folks or the climate toolkit folks.
Great. So does someone want to provide a little bit more flavor of what's happening with the Municipal Vulnerability Index and the climate toolkit? Are we leaning on Erica to help out with this?
I think Marion and I can both do that. Actually, Marion's leading the climate toolkit task group, and I'll turn it over to her in a second after I briefly say that the Municipal Vulnerability Index task group, which is comprised largely of rural resilience, but also has representation from Just Transitions and Science and Data. We met early and were early, I should say, earlier in the year after the plan was adopted to really hone in on what the RFP would look like, because we have resources to put towards that tool and mapping effort. And we've just had some stalling components with respect to work with our Agency of Digital Services and some review internally. And we are, as we're just about ready to post the life cycle analysis RFP, we're just about ready to post the Municipal Vulnerability Index RFP too. So I will be sure to share those posts as they go up so others can share them with folks who they might be interested in bidding on it. Marion, you want to, the climate toolkit's a much more active group.
Sure, I can provide a quick update. As Erica said, this is a ongoing work with support mostly from the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, but there are also folks from Just Transitions and Science and Data that sit on the toolkit task group. They have been meeting every other week for a few months now to work on really pulling together a hub of resources that municipal leaders and volunteers and technical assistance providers will be able to access and use across the spectrum of climate action. So focusing a lot on resilience and adaptation, but also thinking about how do we pull in resources related to mitigation and carbon sequestration. There's sort of 3 points that the group is working on right now. The first is thinking about continued engagement with municipal leaders and communities, municipalities, as well as communities within those municipalities on what would be most helpful in a toolkit and what they're really looking for in terms of resources as they think about climate planning initiatives, as well as climate action and implementation on projects. We're also thinking about and working on connecting with technical assistance providers, so regional planning commissions, state agencies, across the spectrum of climate action to think about how we can better connect resources to amplify their efforts. And then we're meeting in a few weeks with folks from our state IT to think about actually design of that toolkit as it will sit on the climate change website, how to make that easy and usable for folks to really expand their capacity to take on climate work. So a lot of work going on and a lot of momentum moving that forward.
Super. Okay, great. Excellent. All right. Anything else, folks, on those issues for those who are participating in that work? Okay, Joey?
Just a quick question. It sounds like great work. One of the questions I have for you, Marion, or anyone else on the task group related to the Municipal Vulnerability Index is, how are you guys thinking about, people might know we're going to talk legislative stuff momentarily, the Municipal Energy Resilience Bill has passed. I'm just curious how that might be, like how you're integrating that opportunity, or if you haven't yet quite thought of it, that's okay. I just wanted to ask.
Are you asking about the toolkit? I think you said Municipal Vulnerability Index, but you're asking about the toolkit.
Oh, sorry. The toolkit.
No, it's okay. Different but related efforts. So great question. I'm actually working and have been meeting with a group of folks across state government following and tracking the passage of the Municipal Energy Resilience Initiatives and the programs they're in. That's going to be headed up by the folks at BGS and the SEMP program. We've been working closely with Brian Sewell there to ensure that the messaging is coordinated across state agencies. And so we just met last week to discuss that a bit further. So we would use the toolkit and that platform to amplify any messaging through BGS and through their work with the regional planning commissions to implement that program. So hoping that work continues to be coordinated across state government.
Cool. Okay, great. Just transitions. I don't know if Sue is back. She had to step away for a moment. Sue, are you back or are you still off?
I'm here.
All right, great. We can't see you, but we definitely hear you.
Yeah, it's hard. Hold on, I can open my, I should be able to see me now. Can you see me now?
Yeah, and your sound is a little low because the mask, but can you do that sneaky little thing where you stick your...
Got it. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, great.
Okay.
Thanks.
What am I being asked to do?
Just what's going on in Just Transitions real quick. We've heard a lot this morning about the public engagement task group that's been instrumental in finally, making that strategy clearer and getting out and doing partner engagement. Other things you want to say about what's happening in Just Transitions?
Well, I guess other than our fond farewell for Iris, we do have new members joining us. And has that already been announced? I'm sorry, I had to step away.
It's been mentioned and there's been a link in the chat around changing membership. But
Yeah.
If you want to just say a word about what that means for Just Transitions, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, we have a couple of youth members joining, one in their sort of 20s and one in high school. So we're very happy about that. We also have membership from the Upper Valley involved with Vital Communities doing sort of groundwork with mobile homes and weatherization and home improvements, small scale. So someone thinking a lot about new strategies around engagement kind of on the front lines. We have, who else? I'm going to need help. Those were the people I interviewed. But we are happy because I think all of these are folks who have experienced different kinds of experiences with engagement and also capacity to add, because our group hasn't been able to engage as much in all the other groups as we feel they really need to now. So I think our work is a lot about the public engagement. It's also about thinking about our guiding principles and how they are or can be integrated into policymaking, and the measuring of our work. How do we actually think about measuring our progress on various indicators, but including our guiding principles? There's a group that's been working with state agencies to think about sort of the equity assessment and ways in which the guiding principles may be integrated or an addendum to that work within state government. And we're thinking about what do we do around that with legislators and other policymakers. That's probably enough.
That's great, Sue. Thanks so much. Others from Just Transitions who would want to complement that? Kashka, I know you're here too, if you want to weigh in on what's going on there.
Sure. So just like Sue was saying, we're super happy to have all these new members join us because they're from all walks of life. And I think they're going to really add to the complex conversations that we do have on Just Transitions. In addition, I think we also spoke to having some form of a better system of liaisons from the Just Transitions for any folks or any other committees or subcommittees that perhaps need some help in trying to navigate the guiding principles or even the rubric, and trying to navigate that into what they're doing. So I think we spoke to that as well. And we've had some great people come in and talk. And this last time was students from Dartmouth, thanks to Carrie Hangenstenberg. Sorry. So we're just trying to figure out this public engagement and also how we can better support the other committees and subcommittees.
That's great. Thanks, Kashka. Okay, so that's Just Transitions. Any other thoughts on that or questions? Okay, great. All right, so you see the sweep of activity happening. All this effort is happening, much of it in task groups right now. And the subcommittees are trying to make sure their membership is where they need it going into this year and next. Okay, great. So why don't we do this? Let's jump into this final piece that we want on our agenda. I know it's probably in many of your minds, which is about our work plan going forward, and also some lessons from this legislative session that's just closing up in terms of the final outcomes. I believe Secretary Moore has some summary thoughts about sort of rounding up, like how did it go? And so we can start there, and there's some slides there which you can share, or if you'd like me to share, Julie, just let me know.
Yeah, I think Jane has them up on the screen, best I can tell.
Even better. Okay,
so
over to you.
Thanks. I thought I'd just take a minute to sort of provide a high-level review, both of the budget items we discussed previously, I think back in January, as well as some of the legislative initiatives with ties to the cap. And so each of these, this obviously isn't exhaustive, and there was ongoing work within the state budget related to some of the goals of the climate action plan. But this is really focused on new or expanded initiatives promoted with ties to the climate action plan. And so that center column reflects the governor's recommended budget. And you can see by and large, the initiatives that were put forward in the governor's recommend were reflected in the version of the budget that's passed the legislature. As everyone I may be aware, the budget bill has passed. It hasn't yet the governor hasn't taken possession of the bill, which is what we say after legislative council completes their review. And then he has 5 days from when he takes possession to decide whether he will sign it or not. So we're sort of in that space between where the legislature has completed their work and it's waiting on the governor's review. But you can see overall, each of the initiatives aligns fairly well. In some instances, the legislature used a different type of funding than what had been proposed in the governor's budget. In some cases, there's a little bit of difference between the governor's recommend and what was passed the legislature. But on the whole, I would say the climate action budget this year aligns very well with what the governor had recommended. It includes funding for the Office of Climate Action at ANR, and the one-time money we had asked for to sort of fill out some of the budgets for the studies that were statutorily mandated, among other pieces. And can pause there for a minute if folks have questions about any of what's shown on this page.
Questions, thoughts about the budget piece here? Sue, go ahead.
I'm noticing the environmental justice investment, and I'm sure that syncs with the environmental justice bill, which I guess if you've shared already, I haven't heard the status of that. But I guess assuming this budget bill passes, would the investment in environmental justice be sustained even if the EJ bill doesn't get sustained?
I may defer to Secretary Clauser to help answer that question, but no, I believe that that funding, while reflected in the big bill as with a placeholder, it is actually contingent on S-148. And as folks may know, this has been a concern the agency had flagged in that the funding for our existing environmental justice and civil rights coordinator position was actually pulled into the environmental justice bill. Which has made some of the conversations a bit challenging. That's why in the as passed the legislature column, it reflects a $150,000 net increase in our base general fund. The bill contains $200,000, but that was offset by a $100,000 reduction in our base funding when that position was pulled in to be part of this bill. I don't know if Kristen's on the line and wants to speak more to that, because I do know there are placeholders in the big bill for each of the major policy initiatives, including the environmental justice bill.
Thanks, Julie. I don't have much to add because you nailed it. It really is placeholder language in the big bill that would only take effect if the policy bill, if the corresponding policy bill passes with that policy language, or I should say assigned by the governor, it's already passed.
Yeah, that could go very poorly, like that start.
Liz, you had a question as well?
Not a question, just a minor clarification. That third line on the electric service upgrade, the 5 million extra in the as passed is actually, it is electric upgrade related, but it's actually specifically for the Station Save water heater program, which some are aware of. So I just wanted to point that out. Probably not a separate line item, but it's 20 million in the electric service upgrade and 5 million for that water heater switch.
Yeah. Thanks, Liz. Great.
Yes, thank you, Liz. Sorry, that was a somewhat of a shorthand in trying to squeeze stuff on one sheet. So the next sheet is just the status of key legislation with ties to the CAP. Jane had provided a list to the council earlier in the session that identified a number of different legislative proposals related to some of the recommendations coming out of the Climate Action Plan. This summary reflects, I think, 10 of them, 6 of which were taken up by the legislature and passed both bodies. As I mentioned with the budget, there are 5 of those that are still in that space between where the governor hasn't taken possession of the bills yet. And so the action will be forthcoming. And then, as I'm sure folks are aware, the 6th one of those bills is an act relating to the clean heat standard that was vetoed. I'm happy to answer questions about any of the ones, particularly that were sort of worked on by the legislature this year. I probably have less information about the ones that weren't worked on by the legislature, just because we haven't spent any time there.
Okay, great. Any reactions to this real quick before we go to the next place, which is thinking a little bit about our work plan going forward? Okay. All right. Well, that's a very helpful summary. Thanks, Julie. I know there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears on all these things too. So a lot of you were, I know, testifying and involved in legislation. Okay. So the next piece on this is about our work plan, if I'm correct. Jane, is that right?
Yep. And I just threw a few slides on after Julie's slides here to just orient you all to the conversation that we had with the steering committee, and building off the legislative work of this session where we want to go in the fall with the council, and looking ahead to what that means for a schedule for council meetings. So briefly, I'm not going to spend much time here on this slide. David popped it up earlier, but I really appreciate this slide that Marion put together and that we've been building upon. It really tries to, in a really nice way, illustrate where the work is happening right now. And what I can say is that around this, that is helpful for all of you as you're thinking about how much we need to meet and when the critical times are to meet, is that most of this work is either building are going to come to fruition this fall, whether that's actually having technical consultants on board and draft work to look at and review, whether it's recommendations for us to be considering for climate action plan addendums, or whether it's actual feedback through public engagement and other components of the work. So all of this work is moving at quick pace right now, but really there aren't any decision points for the council to be thinking about until this coming fall in this space. And much of the updates you've already heard through the subcommittee and task group updates, which everybody just provided. So thinking forward to work planning and what we'd like to propose is that we currently have a June 13th council meeting on the books. We'd like to cancel that meeting. That meeting was largely intended or set earlier this year when we had first put forward a timeline that had envisioned the biomass and transportation recommendations actually being ready to consider by the council this spring as put forward in the climate action plan. We as a group already looked to extend that timeline to the fall. So June would have been a more substantive update from those two task groups, but really we encourage folks to join the task groups, and we've been trying to keep you apprised as we go through webinars and other components of outreach. So I don't think there's much to do there, as well as the partner engagement work, which we spoke to today, is really just starting to get going. And I don't feel like we'll have substantive conversation to have with all of you until later this summer into the fall. So we're going to propose to cancel the June 13th meeting and look to not meet over the entire summer as a council. What that means, though, is likely some substantive meetings this fall, and we'd like to talk with you all about what that schedule could look like. What we've already lifted up with all of you in previous conversations is the need and interest to have a thoughtful conversation around a budget process, and the timeline for that really falls nicely with the fall to have the council consider what the funds are that are needed to recommend to the legislature ahead of the governor's process and budget so that it can all be folded neatly together. Also this fall, we expect there to be recommendations from the biomass and transportation task groups that you as a council will need to decide how you would like to act upon and whether or not we consider those as addendums to the climate action plan. In addition, we didn't have time with the climate plan this year as we moved really fast into the legislative session, but there's a new biennium and we want to be thinking about any way or any further consideration around prioritization, knowing that there are still a lot of actions to start to tick through in the climate action plan and how to set forth a consensus approach from the council around what is next for the legislature to consider. And then there'll be ongoing work, lots of technical analyses and public engagement for the council to be thinking about this fall. Before I sort of pause for conversation about what a council schedule will look like, I do want to say that the steering committee has agreed to continue to meet monthly throughout the summer. We really want to encourage counselors and others to attend and fully contribute in that space, knowing that the council won't be meeting. We'll try and thoughtfully provide space on those agendas so that other counselors can lift up opinions there. There will be a need for a workflow this summer with the steering committee and thinking about some of the issues we've already talked about, subcommittee roles and needs in this time in between plans, a process for you all as a council to lift up prioritization for the new biennium next year, and really be a place to be folding in conversations from public engagement and other updates. So that's what where we're at with the steering committee and the council, but it'd be great to hear from others if this feels right, and then what the cadence would look like this fall to get the work done that we're proposing. I'm going to stop sharing if I can here.
Thanks, Jane. Okay. So it's not an accident that we're combining these two conversations, sort of a reflection of what happened in this legislative session and then our work plan going forward. Those are somewhat related conversations because of the kinds of work that you would need to be doing in the fall. Let's try to tease them apart a little bit, just saying what we're talking about. I'd be interested to start with the schedule piece, just to confirm, as the steering committee did, that this feels like the right approach. And if you have some friendly amendments or outright objections, let's hear them. And then we can have a broader conversation about our lessons from this legislative session and what that means for your work as the council in the fall. So quickly, the schedule that Jane presented, this idea is a full council meeting again starting in the fall, but probably meeting fairly intensely in the fall. The steering committee will continue to meet throughout the summer and be a place where all of you are welcome to come join those steering committee meetings. Any thoughts, reactions, friendly amendments to that? Is that working for everybody? Okay. I'm taking silence as agreement. However, if I shouldn't be, let me know. Leslie Ann, please go ahead.
Thanks, David. Sorry, I'm joining a little bit late here. It's final grades time. What does, I saw Iris smiling because she knows exactly what that means. What does meeting intensely mean in the fall?
Yes, good question. We don't know, but Jane, we've talked about at least a monthly meeting in the fall, probably something more than that. Jane, you say it, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I've proposed, I think, a monthly meeting, September, October, November, and December. That's what I would suggest, but that's what intensely means to me now, just once a month.
Because when I hear intensely, I think 4 hours, 5 hours. So I was just curious if that's what the thinking was also around.
The length of the meeting.
Yeah, I think 3 hours is what we've been striving for since we've finished the plan.
And then the only other thing I'm going to raise, because I missed the part where Iris probably talked about youth participation. And I think if we think about that really, really consciously, if we do have folks that are still in either high school and or university, 3 hours might be a little bit of a chunk for them to sort of give up from their classes. And so maybe thinking about that really consciously and proactively as we move forward to really appreciate and lift up the youth voice in this particular process.
Thanks, Leslie Ann. Yeah. And specific suggestions around that would be really helpful. So I'd welcome if folks have some ideas about how to make that work. Bram.
So I take it that the subcommittees will spend the summer working on the gaps in the plan left by the uncertainty around TCI and the veto of the clean heat standard. So I actually have a few questions. Is it our goal to do a revised version of the climate action plan and submit that to the legislature at some date this year?
Jane, I'll let you answer this. Yeah.
Yeah, I have not been thinking about it as a revised climate action plan, and Secretary Moore can clean up anything I might mistake here, but we've been thinking about it as specifically related to transportation and biomass, that we knew those components of the plan were not complete when we signed on the 1st, and knew that we would advance recommendations for the council to consider as I've been calling it an addendum to the climate action plan, the existing one, whether it's a revised plan, addendum. I'm the nuance of the language is not. Yeah, it can be, we can discuss, but that is something for the council to consider this fall as we advance recommendations, whether that or not that's needed in those space. And I imagine now with the clean heat standard that the cross-sector subcommittee will be considering any reflections or changes in that space possibly as well, but that's very new and I'm not sure what's happening yet there.
Have any of us thought or talked about when we would like to be done with those addenda?
Yeah, there is I know transportation and biomass have a timeline associated with those recommendations coming up to the council for deliberation over the fall months. First, I should say, as a task group, the subcommittee themselves would need to reach consensus or majority votes to push them up to the council, and then the council would consider them.
And my last piece, which I want to tack on here because it may allow Secretary Moore to answer a bunch of stuff all at once, is sort of with the clean heat standard veto, kind of what's our approach to the fact that there are sort of two different processes that may play out in parallel in terms of A&R rulemaking versus our work in an effort to craft recommendations that the legislature may take another shot at the clean heat standard next session.
Great questions. Secretary Moore, you want to take a first stab at those questions?
Sure. Yes. So maybe first just starting by adding only a little bit to what Jane reviewed. I think it will be important for this body to sort of make a decision about if and when to produce a revised plan. Certainly, we've made commitments to the public about what that means in terms of engagement and outreach. And this goes back to the larger conversation about prioritization and just capacity within the climate office to continue to support that work in addition to a number of other tasks. And this is a large, complicated puzzle, but just need to be aware that the capacity within the organization is finite to support any and all of this work. And we're going to have to figure out where folks' priorities lie. That said, I think what Jane described is sort of at least the view I've taken into where we're headed, which is that there were a couple of missing pieces, so to speak, that were acknowledged in the initial climate action plan, and the work to prepare addenda specific to those to add to the plan will be important. In terms of your question, Bram, about A&R rulemaking, I don't see that the agency will move immediately into rulemaking as a result of the action around the clean heat standard. I think that there's time within the framework provided by the Global Warming Solutions Act to continue to have discussion about how best to approach some of the thermal sector reduction needs. But there's nothing that triggers immediate rulemaking activities by the agency. And so I think the ongoing discussion within the Climate Council will continue to be timely.
Great, that's helpful. Rich, go ahead, and I want to make sure if folks want to follow up on any of this, we have some chance for discussion around it too. Rich, go ahead.
Well, I want to thank Bram for raising the question about what's next following the governor's veto of the clean heat standard, and point out that we're 2 years past the passage of the GWSA, and we have failed to take significant action on the two largest sectors contributing to climate pollution, and the clock is running. So I think the cross-sector, I am expecting that the cross-sector committee will take up this question when we meet. We're meeting on Thursday, and try to figure out a path forward here. We need to make sure that we take action on transportation, on biomass, and now also on buildings. And I'd like to invite the administration and others to come speak with the committee about what your recommendations are. So I think it's, Bram, to answer your question, it's going to be a matter of conversation and study at the committee level, probably all through the summer and into the fall. We might just decide that, that the plan is what it is and we don't need to make any changes, or we might decide that we would like to recommend some changes, or perhaps the administration will make some recommendations of its own that we would be able to take up and study.
Great. So you can see how overlapping these questions are about the legislative session and the work of your work going into the fall. Are there other reflections on these two interrelated pieces, the work plan for the fall, and any reflections about what has happened this year in the legislature? Any other reflections? Michelle?
I would just say that, given the fact that we're going into a new biennium, some thinking around how we're going to educate new legislators and old about the process, where we are in the process, and where the opportunities lie. I think some of the analyses that we're undertaking will help better inform some of the trajectory of legislative ideas for assisting in this work, and how we communicate that will be really important. And to the extent that we are going to probably have some key legislators who will be returning, thinking about early communications with those leaders so that we can begin to have a bit of a platform to move from when the elections are over. Those would just be some of my thoughts.
Interesting. Thanks, Michelle. So really thinking about that outreach, and we've heard that in the public, in the comments as well, that we looked at earlier today. Yeah. Jared?
Thanks, David. I just want to step back and provide a little bit of context in terms of where we stand relative to what the Global Warming Solutions Act requires, what our pathways model pointed to, and kind of where we stand now that the two major elements of the climate action plan have failed to move forward. I know this is familiar to many people, but I think it's important. So I just want to pause to repeat that the clean heat standard was designed to achieve over a third of the needed emissions reductions overall by 2030, required by the Global Warming Solutions Act. The Transportation and Climate Initiative was a bit more difficult to model as a regional program, but somewhere around a quarter of the needed reductions. With both of those not moving forward, the only recommendation moving forward that can achieve a significant, at least by the modeling we've seen so far, and by significant, I mean double digit, probably around 10%, and this goes back to what Megan presented earlier, is moving forward with the Advanced Clean Cars 2 recommendations. But it leaves a major gap. And I know that there is a short-term opportunity around federal and state funding to make a down payment and try to help build momentum as we change markets to reduce fossil fuel dependence, both to benefit Vermonters, especially low and moderate income Vermonters who are exposed to high cost and price volatile fossil fuels, and as we try to keep more of that money local. But most of that money, as federal money, has to be expended by 2026. So it may help us meet the 2025 goals, but it will likely be going away at exactly the time that we need to be ramping up significantly to have any chance, any hope of meeting the 2030 requirements. And I just, this is just back of the envelope. I and EAN and others will do additional analysis on this. But I just want to remind folks for context that the weatherization goal that we modeled for weatherization to play its part in meeting the emissions reduction requirements was an additional 90,000 homes by 2030. The $80 million that the governor proposed and the legislature moved forward, and that looks like it will thankfully be deployed. If the average project, if we're focusing primarily on low-income Vermonters who don't have and shouldn't don't have the kind of financial resources and shouldn't have the responsibility to make those upfront investments. You know, an average project cost might be something like $10,000 a home. That's 8,000 homes out of a needed 90,000. Similar on the EV incentive side, I believe there was $12 million specifically for EV incentives in the budget out of a larger appropriation that also related to EV supply equipment, EV charging infrastructure. But $12 million for EVs, if we're looking at $3,000 to $4,000, which is the general range of the state incentives, is 3,000 to 4,000 EVs on the road, which is directly incentivized, which is far short of the 126,000 that was modeled by 2030. So this gets us back to the very conversation we had when the pathways were passed, which is there is a way forward to meet these emissions reduction targets, but they don't happen on their own, and they don't just happen with short-term investments. They need policy clarity, market clarity, levers to help Vermont, incentives to help Vermonters make these changes. And I just want to be really clear, as the person who was appointed to the energy and data analysis seat, I have no confidence. I mean, this plan was already on thin ice with TCI not moving forward. With the clean heat standard, which we were counting on to be the largest single emissions reduction measure, I don't see how we can have any confidence that we will come anywhere close to the 2030 requirements. So I think that I don't know the next steps in terms of, you know, I feel like the clean heat standard was a consensus recommendation of this council, of the climate action plan. And I feel like if the recommendation is to not move that forward, then an alternative that would achieve the same amount of emissions reduction needs to come forward from the administration, from the governor, if they believe there's a better way to achieve this that's different than the consensus recommendation of the council. And I would say the same on transportation. We can't keep pretending that we live in a pre-Solutions Act world where it's okay to be off track of the legal requirements without any plan, any serious feasible plan to meet these requirements.
Okay, thanks, Jared. Yeah. Okay. All right. Other reactions or comments about the work ahead and how you as a council want to be doing this work in the coming months and into the end of the year? Anything else folks want to say? Rich?
Well, let me begin by just echoing what Jared said about the data. And I'm very, personally troubled by the fact that we seem to be kicking the can down the road again. And I want very much not to be in that position a few months from now. And I think that it is appropriate for the council to consider whether we are just the people who prepare a plan and then hope that somebody will do something about it, or whether we have a continuing responsibility to speak the truth about where we're headed and where we're not headed, and the progress that still needs to be made. And I believe that the GWSA establishes us in the latter category, that we have a continuing responsibility to be truthful with the legislature and with the public about where we stand and what we still need to do. And I hope that over the coming months that the council will be able to do that. And certainly in the cross-sector committee, I intend to ask the committee to do that. I don't know where that leads us, but at least we should step up and face the realistic facts about where we are and how much it's costing us to stay where we are, and how much frankly, we could save both in monetary terms and in emissions by stepping forward more quickly. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So again, an echo of the urgency, and I'd see in the chat also some voices of support for that sense of urgency. And Bram, and then June. Yeah.
You know, there are a lot of people on this call who are probably more knowledgeable about this than I am. So I hope you will all correct whatever I say that's wrong. But my understanding of the governor's veto of the clean heat standard was not a categorical objection to the notion of a clean heat standard. It was more, how's it going to be implemented and so forth. So it feels to me, from what I read, that the legislature does have an opportunity to respond to those concerns and recraft the legislation in a way that may well get the administration's support. And so, you know, I think, yes, deeply frustrating that, as Rich said, we're a couple of years past the GWSA and we haven't moved anything substantial forward. And, you know, deeply terrifying that the planet's burning up. And, you know, a year's delay is very meaningful in terms of addressing these things. And also true that it feels like on that one big piece, there's a pretty straightforward path forward. And, you know, I think we know what that is. We kind of don't know exactly what the path forward is absent TCI. But I guess that's the work we'll be doing over the summer.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Bram. June?
So from listening to the conversation, I get the sense that we may be conflating the outcome of H715 with the status of the plan. The plan hasn't changed. The plan is still to recommend that the clean heat standard be adopted. And I don't know that the council needs to change that. I think losing a year of work is not a good thing. And I think that we have an election ahead. I know for a fact that a key chair in the House, Tim Riggland, is not running for re-election. So I think the comment about educating or giving thought to educating the new slate of folks who come in is absolutely essential. From what I can see, the clean heat standard didn't fail by much. There were two things missing, one of which I think the council maybe could work on, but I'll defer to others on that. And that is this business about estimating the cost. Is there a way to get our arms around that in a credible fashion so that that factual basis is available for consideration come January? As for the piece about having the clean heat standard in bill form, I'll be honest with you, I'm out of my depth there. I haven't worked on legislative council, so I don't know what the particulars of that are. But that seemed to me to be really the pivotal point in the veto message. It wasn't a rejection of the clean heat standard per se. So I think this council's being very hard on itself. You delivered a product. It was considered. Perhaps it wasn't our failure. Maybe it was that the legislature wasn't fully prepared to embrace the thinking because there was a critical piece of data missing. Those are my thoughts. But I think, you know, if we can move this forward and not lose the intervening at least 6 months between now and January, that's a legitimate thing for this council to be working on. And Rich, to your point about our role in continuing to tell the truth, you were very precise in saying that we have an obligation to tell the public and we have an obligation to tell the legislature. I think we might include the executive branch in that audience. Or we might simply not refer to an audience and say we have an obligation to continue to educate, period, on the necessity of moving these policies forward. Don't know that that gives anybody any comfort, but that's where I am at 1:51 p.m. on May 16th.
Thanks, June. All right. So just to round out this conversation, on the most practical of issues here, I'm not hearing objection to the schedule of meetings and how you plan to work going forward. Let me do one more round on that, just make sure. Any concerns about the scheduled meetings as presented and the sort of flow of work as presented? Okay.
David, I'm terribly sorry to interject again, but as sometimes happens in our Zoom room, there's a comment in the chat that should be carried forward, just to put a final point on the clean heat standard conversation. That is that there were the concerns about biofuels and the reservations some people expressed about the lack of equity. And those things too belong in the picture, and I apologize for not being more comprehensive in my thinking. Sorry.
Thank you. And that's where I want to go, is to public comment. And so just before I do, just want to memorialize, the plan sounds like it's working for folks. These issues that you've helped frame will be the issues that you're going to have to wrestle with in the fall, and subcommittees can help prep you up for that work going into the fall. Okay. Thanks everybody for that. All right, so let's do some public comment. We've had some in the chat. I'm just looking at from Cheryl Joy's comments, and thanks for that. If you are a member of, if you've been observing this meeting today, you're not a member of the council, you like to comment, now's a great time to do it. Feel free to use that chat or to raise your hand and offer a comment about the things that have been discussed today in this meeting and the plan going forward for the council. Cheryl Joy, let me just turn to you.
Okay. So I apologize because I'm not accustomed to the phone. Can you hear me and see me?
Yeah, you're fine.
Cool. I'm in the car. Hey, I do want to just say a couple of things, and very basically, I could talk a lot more on them. One is the public outreach. I actually have a question, and I don't know if I'm going to get an answer, but that is, what do you want from this? Do you just want people to be able to, I don't know, vent? Or do you just want to share your information with them? Or do you want to receive information and incorporate it into what you're doing? And if so, well, these are things for you guys to think about, because it doesn't look like what I think you want it to be. And additionally, the subcommittees. So you should listen to the subcommittees as well, which really hasn't been totally happening completely, as you all remember. So, and by the way, I want to make sure that I'm not talking to everybody. I'm talking to some people are doing some, it's not everybody that's acting the way that I talk, that I say. So that's part of it. Paying, let's see. The other thing is, when you are reaching and wanting public participation and public comments, just the the forums that you hold isn't all of it. It's here too, and it looks like you've had a lot of input, and I don't see that it's brought to use here. And by the way, thank you, June, for saying what I said in the chat, because that brings it into if one of you say something that the public says, then it actually gets talked about, but not necessarily when the public says something like me or whoever else that you've heard from. Okay, so the other thing is about, and a very big thing is the work with the clean heat standard. It was defeated, and some of it really had to do with ag and ecosystems really recommended against biomass and biofuels. I mean, if you go into it, biofuels are part of biomass, or vice versa. Biomass is a biofuel, though I know they're separated because one's liquid, but it's all the same thing actually, and one impacts the other. There were specific reasons that the clean heat standard failed, and those issues are going to continue. So just to have a new legislator out there, it wasn't only the governor's veto, it was these other issues. Well, I guess that's all I want to talk about. I've got more notes, but that's enough for me.
Thank you, Cheryl Joy. Appreciate those comments. I have a few more hands up. Dale, go ahead, please.
Thank you. This is Dale Azaria with Conservation Law Foundation. And I just wanted to start by expressing my great appreciation for the work that ANR is doing on the transportation rulemaking. I know as a former general counsel of a state department how hard rulemaking is, even for one simple rule. And so for 4 complex rules, I just want to express my gratitude for the work and time that they are putting into that. And, you know, as we grapple with all of the pieces that are still missing right now from our plan moving forward, it is great to see those big pieces that will really make a difference moving forward. That was the first thing I wanted to say. And then the second and last thing that I wanted to say is building off that idea of making sure that the council listens to the content of the public engagement sessions. A few of the things that I heard at the very beginning of this meeting that came out of public engagement talked about the importance of compact development, the importance of developing better public transit systems and other ways to decrease the amount of driving. And so I just want to identify that while I know that the council is hearing that, it's not really clear that those kinds of issues are intended to be a focus of the council's work going forward. So I just wanted to put that out there while recognizing that you do have an awful lot to do. So thank you all for your efforts and for your time.
Thank you, Dale. Appreciate those comments. Rob?
Yes, I'm Rob Kidd with the Vermont Sierra Club. I want to thank the council for all your work that you're doing, and particularly pushing the agency to work on the clean car and clean truck rules. We all know the shortfalls of where we're short on, but I think this is a really important rule that we have to stay on top of to make sure it gets implemented this year, to set the manufacturers on track to supplying Vermonters with the vehicles we need to do the transition. So I thank Megan, Rachel, and Deirdre for submitting all that information. And I just hope the council will stay on top to make sure we move forward to get this rule adapted by this year. So that way it puts all the manufacturers on alert to supply those vehicles in the 3-year time frame. So thank you. Keep up the work, and my blessings to you all for this challenging work.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it. There's one more comment that was sent to me in a chat. I'm just dropping it over in the chats from Ben Edgerly Walsh at VPERG. And you can see it there in the chat. And it says, could you share a public comment? My VPERG's deep appreciation for the hard work of the Transportation Working Group and the DEC team on the clean car standards and rulemaking. Rulemaking isn't glamorous, but it's incredibly important. So building off Rob's comments and Dale's comments as well. Okay. Anything else from folks who have been observing our meeting today? I really appreciate people taking the time to observe the meetings and to make these comments. And the council, you know, can express their appreciation too. I know that there's a lot of appetite to hear. George, go ahead.
Afternoon.
Hi, George.
It's been a while since I've been at the Climate Council. I really, for public comment here, but in the wake of the legislative season closing down as it did, I was reflecting on the clean heat standards current status and how it could be repaired. I think it is repairable, and I think that a large focus needs to be directed at what are, I think, the weaknesses that are currently there. They're not easy to fix, but nonetheless need to be done. Certainly the most important is to have a scalable, equitable funding mechanism that in the long term, over the next 2 or 3 decades, can generate literally ultimately millions of dollars, maybe even $1 billion of climate action plan funding. This is sort of a fundamental cornerstone. Without investment, nothing really happens. And frankly, we have to come to grips with that, I think. And the clean heat standard was fairly mute about that. And in particular, unlike some other carbon tax proposals that we've seen in the past, there was very little economic modeling done to suggest what outcomes one could have. In my experience with, of all things, my wife running for office for the House of Reps a couple of years ago, we did a lot of door-to-door canvassing. And we're in a fairly rural community and an area where many homes are of lesser means, are struggling to make their ends meet. And they travel large distances to get to their workplace. They have relatively poor housing stock that's hard to heat. And so when I look at the equity issue, I think of those folks and how is it that we can generate a policy that is reasonable and within their means, because it is frankly a part of our population that is not necessarily widely represented at our table, and yet nonetheless is just as much important as any other, if not more important, because they're rarely heard from enough. I think that's a central issue the clean heat standard needs to confront. The other issue with respect to biofuels is a more technical one. And I'm not going to get into the weeds about the particulars, but the life cycle assessment of biofuels has clearly shown that the first generation ones, specifically the biodiesel pathways based on soybeans, are very land use intensive and have, when they scale up the way they are planning to and across the nation and across the globe, have severe adverse impacts on our ecosystems and forests and agricultural lands, competition with food. All these factors make scaling up the biofuels an extremely treacherous path to move forward and set your central plank on. And so I think there needs to be some checks on the amount of biofuels that is used in the goals that we set for the clean heat standard when we send it back to the legislature next year. Those are the two central premises of I think we need to focus the attention. Perhaps there are others that I have not mentioned. I certainly hope people can come around to a consensus about what to do with these respective issues. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, George. And thanks everyone for these really thoughtful comments. All right, folks, we're a little bit past time and I'm glad we spent the time to invest in listening. I know that Secretary Clauser had to sign off. So with that, I think we'll finish up today. And everybody plug yourselves into the work as you can through the task groups, joining steering committee meetings that'll be scheduled over the coming months. And then we as a group will convene in the fall to pick up all of these issues we're talking about right now. Jane, is there anything else before we close up that you want to say?
Nope, that's all great. Probably just one more goodbye to Iris.
One more goodbye.
But otherwise, yeah, thanks for everybody leaning into the conversation today.
Take care, everybody. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks, everyone. Be in touch.